Fake HOA police tried arresting me, but they didn't know I'm a FBI agent. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Ridge subdivision as Agent David Mitchell pulled his unmarked sedan into the driveway of his modest two-story colonial home. After 18 months of deep cover work, infiltrating a human trafficking ring along the Mexican border, he was finally home. The assignment had taken everything out of him, both mentally and physically, but the operation had been a complete success. 12 major players were now behind bars and countless victims had been freed from modern slavery. David had specifically chosen this quiet suburban neighborhood when he purchased the house 3 years ago. Maple Ridge was the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business, and the most exciting thing that happened was the annual block party. The Homeowners Association was supposed to be minimal, just basic maintenance of common areas, and ensuring property values remained stable. It was perfect for a federal agent who needed a peaceful sanctuary between dangerous assignments. As he stepped out of his car, David noticed several things that seemed different about his neighborhood. There were new signs posted at every corner displaying various rules and regulations. The font was official, looking almost militaristic in its precision. Speed limit signs had been reduced from 25 to 15 miles per hour. Parking regulations were posted every 50 feet along the street. Most concerning were the men in crisp uniforms patrolling the sidewalks with clipboards and radios. David had been gone for over a year, and neighborhoods could change, but this transformation seemed extreme. The uniforms worn by the patrolling men resembled police uniforms, but something about them felt wrong. The badges looked authentic from a distance, but the patches on their shoulders read Maple Ridge Security Division instead of any official law enforcement agency. Their belts carried handcuffs, pepper spray, and what appeared to be tasers, but no firearms. Walking up his front walkway, David noticed a bright orange citation stuck to his front door. The violation notice was printed on official-looking letterhead, complete with a seal and case number. According to the document, his lawn exceeded the maximum allowable grass height by 2 inches. The fine was $300 with an additional $50 fee for each day the violation remained uncorrected. The citation was signed by someone called Chief Security Officer Williams and was dated just 2 days ago. Inside his house, David found everything exactly as he had left it, but taped to his kitchen table was another notice. This one informed him that his garbage cans had been placed at the curb 12 hours before the acceptable time window. The fine for this infraction was $150. A third notice informed him that his mailbox post needed repainting due to minor weather damage. The cost for this violation was $200 plus a mandatory inspection fee of $75. David sat down at his kitchen table and examined the citations more carefully. The quality of the printing was professional, and the legal language sounded legitimate, but several details raised red flags. The address for payments was a post office box rather than a physical office. The phone number listed had an area code from 3 states away. Most importantly, the legal statutes referenced in the citations did not match any actual municipal or county codes that David knew of. Being a federal agent, David had developed an instinct for detecting fraudulent documents and illegal operations. These citations had all the hallmarks of an elaborate scam, but the scope and organization suggested something more sophisticated than typical neighborhood grifters. Someone was running a professional-level confidence game, targeting his entire subdivision and possibly others in the area. David decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to gather more intelligence. What he discovered over the next hour was both impressive and disturbing. The fake security officers were conducting themselves with military precision. They moved in coordinated patrols, documented everything with photographs, and maintained constant radio communication. Their uniforms, equipment, and procedures were designed to mimic legitimate law enforcement, as closely as possible without actually crossing the line into impersonating police officers. At the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, David observed one of the uniformed men, citing an elderly resident for having decorative garden stones that exceeded the maximum allowable height. The homeowner, a woman in her 70s, was clearly intimidated and agreed to pay the $200 fine immediately rather than risk additional penalties. The security officer accepted her check with professional courtesy and provided her with an official-looking receipt. David followed the officer from a distance and watched him repeat similar interactions with several other residents. Each citation was for seemingly minor infractions like mailbox placement, fence height, flower bed borders, or decorative lawn ornaments. The fines ranged from $100 to $500, and most residents paid without question. The officer's demeanor was always professional, but carried an underlying threat of escalating consequences if violations were not corrected immediately. By the end of his reconnaissance walk, David had identified at least 6 different fake security officers operating in his neighborhood. They worked in pairs, maintained radio contact, and followed carefully scripted procedures for issuing citations and collecting payments. The operation was generating thousands of dollars per day in fraudulent fines from intimidated homeowners who believed they were dealing with legitimate authorities. That evening, David began researching the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association more thoroughly. What he found confirmed his suspicions about the scope of the fraud. The original HOA had been a simple organization focused on maintaining the neighborhood's pond and common areas. Annual dues were minimal, and the association rarely interfered with individual homeowners' choices about their properties. According to public records, the HOA had been taken over 6 months ago by a new management company called Community Standards Enforcement LLC. The takeover had been accomplished through a series of legal maneuvers that appeared legitimate on the surface, but contained several irregularities that suggested fraud. The new management company had immediately implemented extensive rule changes and hired the security division to enforce compliance. Community Standards Enforcement LLC was registered in Delaware, which made tracing its ownership structure difficult. The company had no physical address beyond a registered agent service and no website or public information about its operations. Phone calls to the number listed on the citations went to a professional answering service that promised to forward messages but never returned calls. David realized he was dealing with a sophisticated criminal organization that had essentially hijacked his neighborhood's homeowners association and was using it as a front for an elaborate extortion scheme. The fake security officers were collecting thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy that prevented most victims from questioning their authority. As a federal agent, David knew he could not simply reveal his identity and shut down the operation immediately. Doing so would likely cause the criminals to scatter before he could identify all the players and determine the full scope of their activities. Instead, he needed to gather evidence carefully and build a case that would result in prosecutions and recovery of stolen funds for the victims. The next morning, David was awakened by loud knocking on his front door. Through his bedroom window, he could see 2 of the fake security officers standing on his front porch with official-looking clipboards. Both men were large and intimidating, wearing uniforms that looked remarkably similar to actual police gear. Their body language suggested they were accustomed to having their authority accepted without question. David took his time getting dressed and gathering his thoughts before answering the door. He needed to play his role as an ordinary homeowner while gathering as much intelligence as possible about the criminals' operations. The key was to appear cooperative, but not too eager while documenting everything for his eventual case file. When David opened the door, the larger of the 2 officers stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried practiced authority. The man introduced himself as Sergeant Thompson from the Maple Ridge Security Division and explained that David had accumulated multiple violations during his extended absence from the neighborhood. According to their records, David owed over $800 in fines and fees for various infractions, including lawn maintenance, garbage container violations, and failure to maintain his mailbox to community standards. David played the role of a confused homeowner and asked to see the officer's credentials and documentation of his alleged violations. Sergeant Thompson produced what appeared to be an official badge and identification card, along with a thick folder containing photographs and violation notices. The quality of the fake credentials was impressive enough to fool most ordinary citizens, but David noticed several subtle details that marked them as fraudulent. The conversation continued for several minutes, with David asking reasonable questions about the citations and payment procedures, while the fake officers maintained their authoritative demeanor. What became clear was that the criminals had developed responses to most common objections and had procedures designed to pressure homeowners into immediate compliance. They emphasized the escalating nature of penalties and suggested that failure to pay could result in legal action and liens against the property. David eventually agreed to pay the fines, but requested additional time to review the documentation and arrange payment. The officers were reluctant to grant any delay, but eventually agreed to return in 2 days for full payment. They made it clear that additional penalties would accrue if payment was not received on schedule, and that continued non-compliance could result in more serious consequences. After the fake officers left, David immediately began documenting everything about the encounter. He photographed the citations and violation notices, analyzed the fake credentials, and began building a comprehensive case file. The level of sophistication in the fraud was remarkable, but several vulnerabilities in their operation were becoming apparent. That afternoon, David drove to the actual municipal building to research the legal status of his neighborhood's homeowners association. What he discovered at the county clerk's office confirmed that the takeover of the HOA had involved forged documents and fraudulent filings. The legitimate homeowners association had never voted to approve the rule changes or hire a security division. The criminals had essentially stolen the association through paperwork fraud and were now using it to steal money from residents. David also visited the local police station to inquire about any reports of fraudulent HOA enforcement in his area. The desk sergeant was immediately interested when David described the fake security officers and their tactics. According to police records, similar operations had been reported in 3 other subdivisions over the past year, but the criminals had always disappeared before investigations could be completed. The police had identified the scheme as a form of organized fraud, but lacked the resources to conduct the type of extended investigation needed to catch the perpetrators. The criminals were careful to avoid actually impersonating police officers, and their activities technically fell into gray areas that made prosecution difficult. Most victims were reluctant to come forward because they were embarrassed about being fooled or feared retaliation. David realized that his federal authority and investigative experience made him uniquely positioned to bring down this criminal organization. The fraud was sophisticated enough to have interstate implications which would justify federal involvement. More importantly, the criminals had no idea they were targeting a federal agent, which gave him significant advantages in gathering evidence and building a case. Over the next 24 hours, David developed a comprehensive plan for exposing and prosecuting the fraudulent HOA enforcement scheme. His strategy involved multiple phases designed to gather maximum evidence while protecting the safety of neighborhood residents who had become unwitting victims. The key was to maintain his cover as an ordinary homeowner while systematically dismantling the criminal's operation. The first phase involved extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering to identify all participants in the fraud. David used his federal resources to run background checks on the fake security officers and trace the ownership structure of Community Standards Enforcement, LC. What he discovered was a network of criminals with extensive histories of fraud and confidence schemes. The second phase would involve working with local police to coordinate arrests and evidence seizure. David needed to time the takedown carefully to ensure that all participants were captured and that stolen funds could be recovered for victims. The criminals had been careful to operate within legal gray areas, but their actions clearly constituted fraud, conspiracy, and theft under federal statutes. The final phase would involve working with federal prosecutors to ensure that charges were filed appropriately and that the case resulted in meaningful penalties for the perpetrators. David wanted to ensure that the sentences were severe enough to deter similar schemes in other communities while also securing restitution for all victims. As David prepared for the fake officer's return visit, he felt a familiar sense of anticipation that came before major operations. The criminals had chosen the wrong target when they decided to victimize his neighborhood. They had no idea that their carefully planned fraud was about to collide with 18 years of federal law enforcement experience and the full weight of the United States Department of Justice. The morning of the scheduled return visit, David positioned recording equipment throughout his house and ensured that backup surveillance was in place. He had coordinated with local police to have unmarked units positioned around the neighborhood, ready to move when he gave the signal. Federal prosecutors had already reviewed his preliminary evidence and confirmed that charges could be filed as soon as arrests were made. When Sergeant Thompson and his partner returned to David's house, they carried themselves with the same false authority they had displayed during their first visit. They demanded immediate payment of all fines and fees and produced additional citations for new violations they claimed to have discovered. Their aggressive approach was clearly designed to intimidate homeowners into compliance without giving them time to question the legitimacy of the operation. David continued playing his role as a confused homeowner while carefully documenting every aspect of the criminal's behavior. The fake officers repeated their threats about legal action and property liens while maintaining their professional demeanor. They were clearly experienced at manipulating victims and had refined their approach through practice on other neighborhoods. When David requested additional documentation about the legal authority for the citations, Sergeant Thompson became more aggressive in his responses. The fake officer implied that continued questioning could result in additional penalties and suggested that David was being deliberately obstructive. This shift in tone revealed the underlying criminal mentality behind the professional facade. David realized the moment had come to begin the takedown phase of his operation. The criminals had provided more than enough evidence of fraud and had clearly demonstrated their intent to continue victimizing residents. It was time to reveal his true identity and bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on their criminal enterprise. Standing in his own doorway facing two criminals who had been terrorizing his neighbors for months, David felt the familiar calm that came with years of dangerous federal operations. These fraudsters had no idea they were about to discover the difference between intimidating innocent homeowners and trying to run a scam on a federal agent with 18 years of experience taking down criminal organizations. The fake security officers had made their biggest mistake when they chose Maple Ridge subdivision as their target. They were about to learn that some neighborhoods have residents who are uniquely qualified to fight back against criminal enterprises. David Mitchell was ready to show them exactly what happens when professional criminals encounter professional law enforcement. The transformation from mild-mannered homeowner to federal agent happened in an instant. David reached into his jacket and produced his FBI credentials along with his service weapon in a smooth, practiced motion that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. The fake officers went from confident authority figures to cornered criminals in the space of a heartbeat. Special Agent David Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation announced himself in a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of genuine law enforcement. The two fake security officers stood frozen on his front porch as the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had been running an elaborate fraud for months, believing they were dealing with ordinary homeowners who could be easily intimidated and manipulated. David kept his weapon trained on both suspects while using his radio to signal the coordinated takedown that had been planned for this moment. Within seconds, unmarked police vehicles appeared from positions around the neighborhood, and additional federal agents emerged from concealment to secure the scene. The criminals' operation had walked directly into a carefully orchestrated law enforcement trap. Sergeant Thompson, the larger of the two fake officers, attempted to maintain his false authority even when faced with legitimate federal agents. He claimed that there had been some misunderstanding and that his organization was a legitimate security company hired by the Homeowners Association. His partner remained silent, but both men showed clear signs of panic as they realized the scope of law enforcement response surrounding them. David informed both suspects that they were under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, theft by deception, and violation of federal statutes regarding fraudulent business enterprises. Their elaborate uniforms, fake credentials, and professional equipment would all become evidence in a federal prosecution that would likely result in significant prison sentences. As the fake officers were being handcuffed and read their rights, David coordinated with local police to conduct simultaneous arrests of other participants in the criminal enterprise. The surveillance and intelligence gathering phase of his operation had identified 6 additional suspects operating in his neighborhood and 3 other subdivisions. Coordinated raids were taking place across the metropolitan area to shut down the entire network. The investigation revealed that Community Standards Enforcement LLC was part of a much larger criminal organization that had been operating similar fraudulent HOA schemes in multiple states. The group had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from homeowners over the past 2 years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to avoid detection by law enforcement. David discovered that the criminals had researched neighborhoods carefully before targeting them, identifying areas with minimal actual HOA oversight and residents who were likely to comply with authority without question. They had developed detailed procedures for taking over legitimate homeowners associations through fraudulent paperwork, and had refined their enforcement tactics through experience in multiple locations. The fake security officers were trained extensively in appearing professional and authoritative while avoiding actions that would constitute criminal impersonation of police officers. They carried equipment that looked official but was carefully selected to remain within legal boundaries. Their uniforms, badges, and procedures were designed to intimidate victims while providing plausible deniability if challenged by actual law enforcement. The financial structure of the operation was equally sophisticated, with multiple layers of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to make tracking stolen funds difficult. The criminals had established legitimate-looking business entities, complete with registered agents, professional answering services, and official-looking documentation that would pass casual inspection by most victims. David worked closely with federal forensic accountants to trace the flow of stolen money and identify all assets that could be recovered for victims. The investigation revealed that the criminal organization had generated over $2 million in fraudulent fines and fees across multiple states. Much of this money had been moved through complex financial structures, but significant amounts were still recoverable. The case against the criminal organization was built on extensive evidence gathered during David's undercover phase and the coordinated arrests. Federal prosecutors were confident that the charges would result in substantial prison sentences for all participants. The sophistication of the fraud and the number of victims involved made this a high-priority case for the Department of Justice. During the investigation phase, David learned that his neighborhood had been targeted specifically because property records indicated that many residents were elderly or lived alone, making them ideal victims for intimidation tactics. The criminals had researched individual homeowners to identify those most likely to pay fines without question and those most vulnerable to threats about legal action. Several of David's neighbors came forward during the investigation to describe their experiences with the fake security officers. Many elderly residents had paid thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines over several months, believing they were dealing with legitimate authorities. Some had been threatened with property liens or legal action if they failed to comply with increasingly absurd violations. The psychological impact on victims extended beyond the financial losses, with many residents reporting ongoing anxiety about their property and fear of authority figures. Criminals had deliberately created an atmosphere of intimidation and surveillance that made homeowners feel constantly monitored and vulnerable to arbitrary punishment for minor infractions. David realized that prosecuting the criminals was only part of his responsibility to the community. The victims needed to understand what had happened to them and receive assistance in recovering both financially and emotionally from the fraud. He worked with victim services coordinators to ensure that all affected residents received appropriate support and information about restitution procedures. The investigation also revealed weaknesses in the legal structure that had allowed the criminals to operate for so long. The ease with which they had been able to take over legitimate homeowners associations through fraudulent paperwork suggested that additional safeguards were needed to protect communities from similar schemes. David testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for stronger federal oversight of homeowners association governance, and more resources for investigating sophisticated fraud schemes that cross state lines. His experience with this case had demonstrated that traditional local law enforcement resources were inadequate for addressing organized criminal enterprises that exploit regulatory gray areas. The media attention surrounding the case helped educate other communities about the warning signs of fraudulent HOA enforcement and the importance of verifying the credentials of any organization claiming authority over residential properties. David participated in public awareness campaigns designed to help homeowners protect themselves from similar schemes. The federal prosecution resulted in significant prison sentences for all participants in the criminal organization. The leader of the group received 12 years in federal prison, while other participants received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. The court also ordered full restitution to all victims plus additional penalties and fines. The recovery of stolen assets allowed most victims to receive full restitution for the fraudulent fines they had paid. David worked with federal victim services coordinators to ensure that the restitution process was handled efficiently and that all eligible victims received appropriate compensation for their losses. The legitimate homeowners association in David's neighborhood was restored to its original structure and governance with new safeguards implemented to prevent future fraudulent takeovers. The experience had brought the community together in unexpected ways, with neighbors who had previously barely spoken now working together to strengthen their collective security and oversight. David's role in exposing and prosecuting the fraudulent HOA scheme became a model for other federal investigations into similar criminal enterprises. The techniques he developed for gathering evidence while maintaining his cover as an ordinary homeowner were incorporated into FBI training programs for agents working organized fraud cases. The case also highlighted the importance of federal agents maintaining strong connections to their communities and remaining vigilant about criminal activity even when off-duty. David's familiarity with his neighborhood and understanding of normal HOA operations had been crucial in recognizing the fraud and building a successful prosecution. 6 months after the arrests, David received a Community Service Award from the mayor for his role in protecting residents from the criminal organization. The ceremony was held at the neighborhood community center, with dozens of neighbors attending to express their gratitude for his actions. Many of the elderly residents who had been primary targets of the fraud spoke about how his intervention had restored their sense of security in their own homes. The success of the operation reinforced David's belief in the importance of federal law enforcement, engaging with local communities, and remaining alert to criminal activity that might initially appear to be minor neighborhood disputes. Professional criminals often begin with small-scale operations that can grow into major enterprises, if not detected and stopped early. The investigation had also revealed connections between the fraudulent HOA scheme and other criminal activities, including identity theft, credit card fraud, and illegal drug distribution. The criminal organization had used information gathered during their HOA enforcement activities to identify homes that were vacant or occupied by vulnerable residents who could be targeted for additional crimes. Federal agents following up on these connections discovered a network of criminal activity that extended far beyond fraudulent homeowners association enforcement. The original investigation of David's neighborhood had uncovered evidence that led to multiple additional prosecutions and the dismantling of several related criminal enterprises. David realized that his decision to purchase a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood had inadvertently placed him in the perfect position to detect and investigate a sophisticated criminal operation. The criminals had chosen his community precisely because they believed it would provide easy targets who would not question their authority or resist their demands. The irony was not lost on David that the criminals' extensive research into potential targets had failed to identify the one resident who was uniquely qualified to expose their operation and bring them to justice. Their careful selection of a neighborhood filled with vulnerable homeowners had backfired spectacularly when they encountered a federal agent with the skills and resources to fight back. The case became a teaching example in federal law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how criminals often defeat themselves through overconfidence and inadequate intelligence gathering. The fake security officers had been so focused on perfecting their intimidation tactics that they had failed to properly investigate their targets. David's experience with the fraudulent HOA case reinforced his commitment to remaining engaged with his community, even during periods when he was not working active federal cases. The skills and instincts developed through 18 years of federal law enforcement were valuable assets that could benefit his neighbors and community in unexpected ways. The quiet suburban neighborhood that David had chosen as a peaceful retreat between dangerous federal assignments had become the setting for one of his most satisfying professional victories. The criminals who had tried to victimize his neighbors had discovered that some residents are uniquely qualified to defend their communities against organized criminal enterprises. As David settled back into his normal routine in Maple Ridge subdivision, he reflected on how the experience had strengthened his connection to the community and his understanding of the ways that federal law enforcement could serve ordinary citizens. The fake HOA police had made the mistake of targeting a neighborhood that contained a federal agent who refused to be intimidated. The restoration of legitimate governance to the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association marked the end of the criminals' reign of terror, but the beginning of a stronger, more vigilant community. David's neighbors had learned valuable lessons about questioning authority and verifying credentials while maintaining their sense of community security. The success of the federal prosecution sent a clear message to other criminal organizations that sophisticated fraud schemes would be met with equally sophisticated law enforcement responses. David's work on the case had demonstrated that federal agents living in communities across the country serve as an early warning system against organized criminal activity. The fake security officers who had tried to arrest David for HOA violations had learned too late that they had chosen the wrong target. Their elaborate criminal enterprise had collapsed when it encountered a federal agent who possessed the skills, experience, and resources necessary to bring professional criminals to justice. The lesson for other potential victims was clear. When faced with suspicious authority figures or aggressive enforcement of questionable regulations, it is always appropriate to ask for credentials, verify identities, and seek independent confirmation of claimed powers. David's experience showed that criminals often defeat themselves when faced with informed and prepared targets who refuse to be intimidated. The peaceful suburban neighborhood had returned to its normal quiet routine, but with the added security of knowing that at least one resident was always watching for signs of criminal activity. The fake HOA police had tried to arrest the wrong person and had paid the price for their mistake with federal prison sentences and the complete destruction of their criminal organization. David Mitchell continued his federal law enforcement career, knowing that his home community was now better protected against similar criminal schemes. Criminals who had tried to victimize his neighbors had learned that some targets are uniquely qualified to fight back, and that professional law enforcement will always ultimately triumph over criminal enterprises, no matter how sophisticated they appear to be. The story of the fake HOA police who tried to arrest a federal agent became a cautionary tale for criminals and an inspiring example for ordinary citizens who refused to be victimized by fraudulent authority figures. David's successful investigation and prosecution of the criminal organization demonstrated that justice can prevail when professional law enforcement encounters organized crime in American communities.